You know, it's a long-held belief of mine that building a reputation takes 2 decades, while destroying it takes about 5 minutes. If you truly internalize that, your behavior changes. This principle holds for individuals, it holds for corporations, and it most certainly holds for nations. I saw this firsthand early in my career. Back in the 1960s, I observed the American Express Corporation navigate a profound crisis. They had guaranteed the inventories for a solid oil company that was exposed as a massive fraud. The tanks, supposedly filled with valuable oil, were discovered to contain mostly seawater. The reputation of American Express, constructed over a century, was suddenly in jeopardy. Was their guarantee worthless? The stock collapsed. The consensus was that the company might not pull through, but American Express did something remarkable. They honored their commitments. They covered the claims, even at a staggering financial cost. And the result? Their reputation didn't just mend. It became stronger. The world saw that when the pressure was on, American Express stood by its word. This is what institutions do when they prioritize their long-term credibility over short-term financial pain. Here in late 2025, we are collectively observing something I never anticipated seeing. Not just one, but 2 separate constitutional mechanisms are being discussed in earnest, at the same time, for the removal of a sitting president. This is not normal political discourse. This is an institutional emergency. Let's translate this into business language for a moment. Picture a major public company where the shareholders are organizing a lawsuit to oust the CEO for a catastrophic breach of his fiduciary duty. That alone is a crisis. Now imagine that in parallel, the board of directors is secretly convening to use emergency bylaws, declaring that same CEO incompetent and immediately stripping him of his authority. That's not just a crisis. It's a 5-alarm fire. When both the external check the shareholders, or in this case, Congress and the internal check the board, or the cabinet activate simultaneously, it signals a total and complete failure of confidence in leadership. This is the situation we are confronting. I want to discuss this not as a political commentator, but as someone who has spent a lifetime analyzing how organizations either thrive or fail. The patterns of success and collapse are identical, whether you are managing Berkshire Hathaway or a country. And the pattern I am witnessing now is one I recognize as a precursor to organizational disintegration. Let's begin with the facts, because they are what matter. In October 2025, Representative Sherry Tenneco from Michigan put forward new articles of impeachment within the 119th Congress, specifically designated HRES 3553 and HRES 5533. We have seen impeachment articles before, but these are new. They are not a re-examination of Ukraine or January 6th. They center on discrete, recent actions that test constitutional boundaries. The first article, HRES 3553, targets the abuse of trade powers. It alleges the unilateral imposition of tariffs without the required congressional authorization or a valid economic basis. You might dismiss tariffs as a policy dispute, but the reasoning here is critical. The Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, explicitly gives Congress the power to regulate foreign commerce. While presidents have some delegated authority, it is conditional. The allegation is that these conditions were ignored and that tariffs were deployed not as a tool of legitimate trade policy, but as a political cudgel in corporate terms. This is like a board granting a CEO limited authority for routine operational decisions, only to discover he's using that authority to make massive strategic acquisitions and commit the company to enormous debt without approval. That isn't just poor judgment. It is a fundamental violation of the corporate charter. The second article, HRES 537, alleges the usurpation of Congress's appropriations power. This is the constitutional mandate that Congress, and only Congress, determines how federal money is spent. The charge is that funds legally allocated by Congress were unlawfully impounded, effectively frozen by executive decree. This may sound technical, but its implications are profound. When Congress passes a budget, it represents the negotiated will of the electorate. When a president decides to simply not spend that money as directed, he is not just disagreeing with a policy. He is attempting to nullify the constitutional authority of a co-equal branch of government. In business, the appropriations power is the board-approved budget. A CEO cannot simply ignore that budget and redirect capital at will. Any CEO who did so would be summarily fired. It's not a difference of opinion. It is outright insubordination. No functional organization can tolerate it, but this is where the situation becomes truly alarming. Concurrently with these impeachment articles, there is a serious public debate about invoking the 25th Amendment. Section 4 of this amendment empowers the Vice President and a cabinet majority to declare the President unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. This is the ultimate institutional failsafe. It has never been used against an unwilling president, and it is being discussed. The 25th Amendment was adopted in 1967, largely because the Kennedy assassination highlighted the lack of a clear process for presidential incapacity. We had previous instances where presidents were incapacitated: Woodrow Wilson's stroke, Dwight Eisenhower's heart attack, with no clear mechanism for a power transfer. Section 3 allows for a voluntary transfer, such as for a medical procedure. But Section 4 is for an involuntary removal, when a president is unable or unwilling to step down despite being unfit. It is being discussed now not over politics, but over concerns about presidential competence, sparked by specific public remarks that have sent shockwaves through the government. One widely reported example is the president's alleged call for U.S. cities to be utilized as military training grounds. The full context of that remark is unknown, but context is crucial. When you pair statements like that with a broader pattern of erratic behavior, impulsive decisions, and statements disconnected from reality, people responsible for national security begin to worry. They ask, is this person capable of sound judgment during a crisis? If a true emergency strikes, a military attack, a financial panic, can the person with sole authority make a clear-headed decision? When you hear whispers about the 25th Amendment coming from inside the administration, it tells you something profound. It means the people with the closest access, who are in the meetings and see the daily workflow, have lost faith in the president's judgment. That is a terrifying prospect. In a crisis, the president's judgment is the only asset that matters. There is no time for a committee. One person must decide. If their own team no longer trusts that judgment, we are all exposed. In corporate governance, this is a failure of fiduciary duty. A fiduciary is legally bound to act in the best interest of the organization, not themselves. The president, the cabinet, and Congress are all fiduciaries for the American people. When those fiduciaries conclude that the risk of inaction, of allowing the status quo to continue, is greater than the risk of intervention, you see extraordinary measures. Shareholders sue. Boards fire CEOs. Congress impeaches. And cabinets consider the 25th Amendment. What we are witnessing is the ultimate institutional stress test. The external check and the internal check are activating in unison. This does not happen unless the system is under existential pressure. In all my years, I've learned that when multiple independent alarm systems go off at the same time, it's not a drill. It's a pattern. And this pattern signals we are in uncharted waters. Now, let me provide the context, because this crisis did not materialize overnight. Specific actions have led us to this breaking point. In October 2025, several federal prosecutors from the Eastern District of Virginia, the AA, or terminated. The EDVA, often called the Rocket Docket, is a critical jurisdiction, handling major national security and espionage cases. The prosecutors' names were Kristen Bird, Elizabeth Yusi, and Eric Spurt. These were career professionals, not political appointees with decades of combined experience. Normally, U.S. attorneys, political appointees, are replaced with a new administration. This was different. According to numerous credible reports, these career prosecutors were fired for resisting intense pressure to pursue criminal investigations against high-profile political adversaries of the president, namely New York Attorney General Letitia James and former FBI Director James Comey. Both individuals have been in legal conflict with the president. But you do not prosecute someone out of political animus. You prosecute them based on evidence of a crime. When these prosecutors, applying their professional and ethical judgment, concluded that the charges were not supported by fact or law, they refused to proceed. In short, they did their jobs. They upheld their oaths. For that, they were dismissed. Let me explain this in corporate terms, as I've seen variations of this play out. Imagine a CEO whose company is under investigation for fraud. He summons his chief compliance officer, the person whose entire job is to ensure the company follows the law, and demands he certify that the fraudulent financial statements are accurate. The compliance officer refuses, stating, "I cannot sign this. It is a crime." The CEO then fires the compliance officer and finds someone who will sign. That is not management. It is obstruction of justice. It is witness tampering. It is the deliberate destruction of the internal controls that protect the organization. In the corporate world, this triggers ESG investigations and criminal charges. People go to prison. I recall a major corporation in the early 2000s where the CEO did exactly this: pressured accountants, replaced auditors, and purged internal critics. The fraud was eventually exposed. The CEO was jailed, the stock went to zero, and thousands of employees lost their jobs and pensions. It all happened because one leader decided that internal controls were an obstacle, not a safeguard. But what happens when the person doing this is the one who oversees the Justice Department? That is the nightmare scenario. The DOJ is meant to be independent of political influence. A prosecutor's decisions must be based on evidence, not on whether the target is a political ally or enemy. That independence is what we call institutional integrity. It is part of this country's moat. In investing, a moat is a durable competitive advantage that protects a company. For Coca-Cola, it's the brand. For Facebook, it's the network effect. For Apple, it's the switching costs of its ecosystem. America's moat is not its military or its resources. America's moat is the rule of law. It is the belief that we are governed by laws, not by individuals. That the rules apply to everyone, no matter how powerful. That is what makes America a beacon for investment and talent. When you breach that moat, when you weaponize the Justice Department, you are not just violating norms. You are destroying your most valuable asset. And reputation, once shattered, is almost impossible to restore. There is another, deeply troubling piece to this pattern. On September 22, 2025, the President issued an executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. Before reacting based on your feelings about Antifa, let me explain why this is so dangerous from a rule of law perspective. I am not defending political violence from any side. My concern is the process or lack thereof. The order uses broad, vague language, calling Antifa militarist anarchist enterprise. But it fails to cite a specific legal authority for a domestic designation of this nature. Historically, terrorist designations follow a rigorous process led by the State Department, under clear statutes from Congress, involving intelligence agency evidence and congressional oversight. There are checks and balances. Why? because the powers unlocked by this label are extraordinary. It allows the government to freeze assets without due process, conduct surveillance without normal warrants, and arrest people under special provisions. These are awesome powers, reserved for existential threats, not for domestic political movements. However odious. Furthermore, Antifa is not an organization in the traditional sense. It's not ISIS or Al-Qaeda with a command structure, membership roles, and funding. It is a loose, decentralized ideology. Designating Antifa is like designating libertarianism. It is so vague that it becomes a tool to target almost anyone. Attend a protest in black? You could be a terrorist. Donate to a bail fund? You could be supporting terrorism. This is precisely its danger. Critics, including the ACLU and numerous legal scholars, argue this order is an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment. You have a right to hold unpopular views and to protest. Those rights can only be abridged in the face of a specific imminent threat, not a blanket designation of an ideology. If this can be done to Antifa, it can be done to any group. In business terms, this is the definition of unpredictable regulation. When evaluating an investment, I assess regulatory risk. Can the rules be changed by decree? I was cautious about investing in China in the 1990s for this exact reason. The government could change the rules overnight, seize assets, or outlaw business. That kind of uncertainty is the enemy of investment. The same principle applies to civil liberties. When citizens fear their political beliefs could get them labeled as terrorists, they stop speaking. They stop organizing. This is the chilling effect. It is how free societies die not with a bang, but with a quiet, self-imposed silence born of fear. Let me connect these dots. The pattern is one of concentrated power, exercised without restraint, justified by emergency, and hostile to all accountability. This is the exact pattern present in every major organizational failure I have ever studied, from Enron to Lehman Brothers. When leadership decides the rules don't apply to them and silences internal critics, collapse is inevitable. We are witnessing reputational contagion. When trust is lost in one part of the system, it spreads. When prosecutors are fired for upholding the law, other prosecutors learn to go along to get along. When an executive order can bypass the law, people learn to keep their heads down. When Congress is ignored and the cabinet is mutinous, the public learns the system is broken. I've spent 70 years investing, and I've learned that institutions are more durable than individuals. Good institutions can withstand bad leaders, but bad institutions or broken ones cannot be saved, even by individual brilliance. This is why I'm so concerned. This is not about policy. It's about whether the system itself is functional. And the dashboard is flashing red. Impeachment is a warning light. The 25th Amendment discussion is a warning light. The firing of prosecutors is a warning light. The unconstitutional executive order is a warning light. Any one of these is a crisis. All of them at once is a systemic failure. I am not predicting that impeachment will pass, or that the 25th will be invoked. I am saying that the fact these conversations are necessary signals that the normal guardrails have failed. We are treating this like just another political brawl, but it is different. When both external and internal checks are trying to constrain a leader, the system is screaming for help. If this pattern continues, the outcome is predictable. First, the people of integrity leave. Second, those who remain focus on survival, not service. Third, decision-making becomes catastrophic as the leader is shielded from accurate information. Fourth, the organization becomes brittle, unable to respond to real challenges. Finally, it breaks. When governments fail, it is not the powerful who suffer. It is the ordinary citizens who pay the price. I am an optimist by nature. I have always bet on America. But optimism requires facing reality. And the reality is that our institutional margin of safety is razor thin. The fact that these emergency tools are on the table means that people sworn to protect the Constitution believe we are near the edge dot in investing. I am fearful when others are greedy. Right now, many are greedy for short-term political power. That makes me fearful, not for myself. I'm 95, but for the country my grandchildren will inherit. This reminds me of the Penn Central Railroad in the 1980s, a massive company, strong on paper, but rotting from the inside. Management was focused on financial engineering while the core infrastructure decayed. They insisted everything was fine, right up until the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. That's what happens when you ignore institutional rot. I fear that is where we are. The facade looks intact, but the foundations are crumbling. We must pay attention. We must demand accountability. We must think long-term, putting the health of the institution above the success of any party. We must speak up. Bad news does not get better with age. I've lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and Watergate. We survived because enough people were willing to put the country and its principles first. This is not about politics. It is about whether we have a functional system of government. The dual pressure of impeachment and the quoted 25th Amendment isn't just drama. It is a symptom of systemic failure. It is the engine warning light telling us to pull over now before the damage is irreversible. If we don't, we risk a crisis of legitimacy that could take generations to repair. The clock is ticking, and our margin of safety is thinner than it has ever been.